I'm very, very proud of her, and I love that she's taking a stand and she's doing it so eloquently and she's doing it so brave. It's wonderful to see.
They promised forever, and then, in Meri's words, he quietly pocketed the forever and left her with a receipt, her first sentence landing in the courtroom with the weight of a verdict. Not a claim, her voice level as a spirit level, and twice as uncompromising, her eyes not the wild blaze of rage but the slow, banked burn of someone who has sifted through ashes and found the shape of the house that once stood. Opposite her, Kody Brown, the Sunday night patriarch polished to a TV gleam for a decade, sat pared down to the man beneath, the posture jaw clenched, tie obediently dark, hands still in a way that only hands with nowhere honest to go can be on. Beside him, Robyn, the legally wedded favorite in the audience's folk memory. Color drained, mouth set, fingers hooked through Kody's as though his knuckle bones were the last brass rail in a carriage that had already left the tracks. While the room around them thrummed with the skittish hum of lenses and lungs and legal pads, a full gallery holding its breath in that special, heavy way that people do when the story they've been sold is about to meet the story that happened. For years, the Browns had been a photograph that smiled back at the world for wives. One husband, a democracy of affection claimed in voiceover. A brand of unity lacquered and lit, but Meri's folder fat, softened at the corners by handling, thick with wire slips and emails and deeds and those antiseptic lines of small print that are immune to charm, told a colder tale. After Las Vegas, after the relocation to Flagstaff's thin, pitiless air, after the press shots where everyone's teeth made the same white promise, something that had been shared in spirit began to be fenced in practice. What started as "don't worry about it and we'll go through that later" turned, almost without anyone hearing the click, into transfers with a destination that didn't include the first wife's name, then into an LLC whose title narrowed the word family down to a pair of initials, and then into a policy that talked about provision while forgetting 3/4 of those who waited to be provided for. The judge, stone-haired, stone-eyed, his voice like the flat side of a spade, didn't need theatrics, and Meri didn't offer any. She simply laid out dates the way a surveyor pounds pegs into soil, each one fixed, each one joined by taut line. To the next, the week they were told budgets were tight, the day 6 figures left a shared account for a freshly minted company with 2 directors. The morning a production deposit, the very fuel of the family's myth, skipped the communal ledger and landed in a quiet new harbor. The month a temporary arrangement put down roots longer than the marriage that fronted it. You could feel the room's temperature change from opinion to arithmetic as the printouts did their slow lapwire receipts over £200,000 or dollars, depending on which side of the state line you stand, to count into a corporate stomach labeled with 2 names only. Internal emails from a property manager that named Robyn the point person and authorized funds from the private account. A group chat where we already agreed stood in for the meeting that never was. A policy document that had the brass to call itself protection whilst protecting only the branch that already had the shelter of legality. And if Robyn's tissue quivered prettily in her hand the way it always had on camera, if Kody's mouth did that rueful downturn that used to sell disappointment as leadership, the papers ignored it with the perfect frozen civility of numbers. Meri did not raise her voice because she had already learned the oldest rule of these rooms, that the decibel level of a truth bears no relation to its weight. And when she said, very simply, that equal on television had turned into unequal, on paper, the phrase sat there like a brick you could stub your foot on. More dates, more sums, more instruments, because betrayal in these stories never travels alone. It brings a calendar and a calculator, and as each piece took its place, the public myth of the benevolent center giving fairly to the edges started to look less like a family and more like a funnel. Robyn, when the judge's eyebrow tilted in her direction, murmured that she had trusted that there was pressure, that nothing was meant to wound, as though intent could launder outcome. But Meri, without malice, returned that access is agency. And a signature is a sentence you write upon other people's lives. Had this been a reunion special, someone would have cut to ad before the hard thing landed. But the court does not cut for comfort. And so the hard thing landed. Orders to freeze the relevant channels. A refusal to grant delay in the name of Tane. I'll come to lays in the name of Tane. Like, look at this. And we all know I've been exploring that. And we all know I've been exploring that path. But the court does not cut for comfort. And so I see a first tame work. I see if they courted so far. We see if CCCCCCC quote wicca life isid day C with CC quote a CCCCC with C with CC with CC with kikith a CC with a cunly cuffed a C we with you to CC with C with to with a ka I they can got I you to CC to agree to you to take a cute anyway with if we're at it with you got surprise and the low. Procedural clatter of a case that had been all mood for the public, now turning into process for the record. Outside, headlines bred like Pigeon's first wife's folder flips family fairy tale. Secret accounts, selective love, but the woman they chased did not angle her face to the light. She simply walked, lighter in that peculiar way people look, when they have moved a weight from their chest to the table and told it to speak for itself. And if anyone in the corridor thought to ask the easy questions about jealousy or ratings, they found no purchase, because Meri wasn't performing hurt. She was doing the colder, braver thing, naming it, dating it, totaling it, and then standing. Very still, while the numbers did what numbers do, strip the varnish and leave the grain. When the court resumed after that bruising first session, the silence inside was of a different species altogether. No longer the brittle hush of anticipation, but the dampened, heavy quiet that settles after a storm has broken. One roof tile and everyone in the house realizes more may follow. The air in the Flagstaff courtroom clung thick and metallic. People shifted in their seats, not because they were restless, but because they were tethered by the awareness that this was ceasing to be a family. Querrell dressed up in Sunday suits and was evolving into something harsher, drier, judicial, where apologies and tears could no longer be exchanged for absolution. And it was into that space that Meri returned to the stand. No folder this time clutched like armor, but with her, chin raised as though the armor had already been tested and found serviceable. Her words moving beyond the arithmetic of betrayal into the anatomy of how it was made. She described the slow rearrangement of household conversations. How questions once posed in kitchen corners about mortgages and allowances began to be met with deferments. Kody's tired, we'll speak tomorrow. Robyn's already handled it. It's the slow attrition of dialogue until the group dinners that once decided. Its fates shrank into whisper sessions in back rooms from which the rest emerged, only to be informed of outcomes. Janelle, usually silent ballast, leaned forward in her seat as these details spooled, her face carrying the taut recognition of someone who has read these cues before but never seen them declared aloud. And Christine, though absent in body, was invoked by name as Meri recounted the moment she realized her co-wives were not merely marginalized but excised. Land promised to be parceled equally had gone instead into the neat rectangle of a deed bearing 2 signatures alone. Production money had hopped accounts like a school child skipping a rope, always landing on squares already painted with Robyn's initials. And even the soft assurances about temporary arrangements were recast by emails with subject lines, such as finalized transfer and close on property that left no room for the fiction of delay. The judge, that stoic presence with spectacles perched at the low bridge of his nose, read and reread the sheaves handed across. And though he kept his face in judicial neutrality, the faint tick at his temple betrayed the recognition that this was no longer merely about family hurt, but about fiduciary duty, contract, possible fraud, words heavier than sorrow, because they invite sanctions beyond the emotional. Robyn, her tissue already shredded from the morning, dabbed and dabbed as if moisture alone could blur ink, and at last in a voice dry as shredded paper. Muttered that she never asked to be the favorite, that she had simply done what was necessary when others faltered. A line that might once have drawn sympathy in the soft-focus world of reality television, but here only served to tighten Meri's composure. For Meri did not raise her volume. She simply replied that helping does not mean displacing. That being necessary does not excuse being secretive, and that keeping a family together cannot mean cutting most of it out of the frame. Words that carried more sting for being spoken without heat. The gallery shifted again. The public faces of sister wives, watchers who had turned up out of curiosity, now pulled tight in discomfort. Because here was the peacemaker's veil being tugged aside to reveal not accident, but architecture. Not mere negligence, but design. Into this came Janelle herself, summoned not by drama, but by subpoena. Her calm presence a revelation, because the woman who had always played the mediator, who had always told interviewers she just wanted peace, now sat upright and declared that silence had not been peace at all. It had been complicity, that she too had been denied paperwork, excluded from emails, instructed to trust the process that turned out to be a process of exclusion. And with her words, the case gained a weight that no amount of shrugging could shake off. For when the most rational voice in the house finally says the house is burning, the fire brigade listens. Papers, she produced screenshots of text threads, where Robyn deferred queries with Kody, will explain later. Never did. Never did. Did gave substance to suspicion. And her recollection of being told this doesn't involve you, before being ushered from a meeting that concluded with deeds signed in her absence, painted a picture more damning than any outburst. For calm, testimony is the kind that sticks. Kody, confronted with these layered voices of women he once called covenantal partners, kept his eyes drilled into the wood grain of the defendant's desk, his jaw flexing like a man chewing words he could not swallow, the smile with which he once charmed millions conspicuously absent. The judge paused proceedings briefly to acknowledge that the matter had now clearly widened beyond a domestic dispute, warning counsel to prepare for the possibility of criminal referral, and that phrase rippled through the room like the toll of a heavy bell. Criminal. Not just hurt feelings, not just fractured promises, but criminal. A word that sticks to reputations like tar. Outside, reporters clattered down the courthouse steps to file stories before their competitors. Hashtags erupted into new shapes. Hashtag Janelle stands. Hashtag Janelle stands. Hashtag Robyn exposed, and video editors were already cutting the testimonies into viral reels, but inside the women sat shoulder to shoulder. No longer co-wives, not yet vindicated plaintiffs, but something rawer and more compelling. Survivors of silence, learning the tensile strength of shared speech. And as the gavel called for adjournment, the room did not feel emptied of tension, but saturated with it. Because everyone knew that what had been pulled into the light so far was only prologue. That darker revelations, harder evidence, sharper reckonings still waited in the wings. And that the real unmasking was yet to come. When the courtroom reconvened the next morning, it was not with a tentative hush of people still wondering if yesterday had been a performance or an aberration, but with a solemn dread of those who know they are about to witness the dismantling of a myth brick by brick, Each clink of mortar exposing not only structural weakness, but willful sabotage. And the Flagstaff courthouse itself seemed to groan under the weight of expectation. Its pale walls and fluorescent lights transformed into reluctant keepers of history. The bailiff's call for order rang out, but barely registered. For all eyes were already fastened upon the defendant's table, where Kody Brown sat rigid and mute. The same man who once presided over family meetings with polished charm now appearing, more like a relic of hubris caught in a display case, and beside him, Robyn, pale and stiff. Her tissue balled into damp paper that disintegrated between her trembling fingers, as though even cotton refused to hold her pretenses any longer. And as the judge strode to his bench, spectacles glinting under the harsh ceiling light, he paused deliberately, scanning the room with the unblinking gravity of a man who knew his next words would reverberate not only across the docket, but across the millions who had consumed this family's mythology through screens and Sunday night spectacles. And when he finally spoke, it was not as a bureaucrat, but as an arbiter of conscience cloaked in black, declaring that the court had now seen sufficient prima facie evidence of concealment, collusion, and calculated exclusion to escalate the matter beyond domestic arbitration into the realm of legal inquiry. His tone slicing through the stale air like a guillotine, and gasps erupted, not shrieks, not murmurs, but that involuntary collective intake that bodies make when truth refuses to be denied. Meri closed her eyes, shoulders lifting with the relief of vindication, though not yet triumph. And Janelle placed a hand lightly upon the bench before her, as though steadying herself upon the mast of a ship braving a storm. While Kody did not move, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles blanched, his lips pressed into a line that might once have been defiance but now looked more like paralysis. The paralysis of a man finally stripped of the illusion that charm and silence could substitute for answers. For here was the moment when silence itself was placed on trial. And then the prosecutor rose, voice measured but carrying the thrill of momentum, announcing that audio evidence would now be replayed in its entirety, the very recording already whispered across social media. And with a click, the courtroom was once more filled with the scratchy yet unmistakable timbres of Kody and Robyn conspiring in low tones. Words about transfers, taxes, keeping Meri strung along. Words that bled through the speakers like toxins seeping into a well, poisoning any lingering doubt. And when the file ended, the silence that followed was no longer disbelief, but recognition, a silence not of the unknowing, but of the unwilling. For none could now deny that the edifice of family unity had been propped up by deceit, its foundation eaten away by selfishness disguised as foresight. And it was into this silence that Robyn finally rose, her legs trembling, her lips quivering, and for the first time the courtroom beheld not the soft-spoken peacemaker edited by producers into a sympathetic archetype, but the raw, frantic woman beneath, her voice cracking into sobs as she declared she never wanted to hurt anyone, that she had only followed Kody's guidance, that she had acted out of fear, of abandonment. And yet every syllable landed less as exoneration and more as confession. For the jurors, the judge, even the gallery could see that fear had not paralyzed her. It had galvanized her into gatekeeping, into signing papers, into wielding silence, as a scalpel with which to cut sisters out of their own futures. And Meri, watching from her seat, did not flinch, did not soften, but simply murmured, audible enough for the stenographer to record, that being afraid never licensed betrayal, that suffering never excused sabotage, and that keeping the family together by slicing its women apart is not preservation but butchery. And those words hung in the air, heavier than Robyn's sobs, heavier than Kody's silence, heavier than any evidence yet presented. And the judge leaned forward, his tone like granite ground against granite, demanding straight answers. Did she know the funds were joint? Did she know her co-wives were excluded? Did she sign as co-signer with full awareness? And each reluctant yes that Robyn whispered was another nail into the coffin of her cultivated innocence. Each acknowledgement a chisel chipping away at the porcelain mask, until at last, cornered by truth, she erupted, voice shrill, eyes blazing, shouting that they never loved him like I did, that Meri checked out years ago, that Janelle was halfway gone, that Christine despised him, and that she alone had borne the burden of loyalty. And the outburst, far from salvaging her image, obliterated it. For in that shrieking assertion of exclusive devotion, the courtroom saw not love, but monopoly, not sacrifice, but usurpation. And Kody himself turned sharply to her with an expression not of solidarity, but of shock, as if the woman who had been his accomplice had suddenly revealed herself as his accuser too. And in that tableau's weeping favorite, the mute patriarch, the resolute ex-wives. The judge's cold gaze, the entire decade-long mythology of sister wives collapsed. Exposed not as an eccentric experiment in faith and family, but as a stage play masking exploitation, its leading man toppled by his own hubris and his chosen queen undone by her own tears. And still the proceedings pressed on. The prosecutor announcing that forensic auditors had already unearthed shell accounts. One labeled Family Trust, but accessible only by Kody and Robyn. Another routed through a foundation under a pseudonym. Funds traced to school fees, furnishings, investments that bore none of the communal signatures promised. And as the figures scrolled across the projector screen, hundreds of thousands redirected. The gallery gasped anew. And the judge ordered immediate freezing of all related assets. His gavel pounding with finality, declaring that any attempt to move money henceforth would constitute obstruction and incur criminal referral. His words reverberating like thunder, and Meri at that moment exhaled slowly, not in triumph, but in liberation, her eyes shimmering not with tears of grief but with the strange, crystalline clarity of a woman who had finally watched truth walk unassisted into the light. And as reporters bolted once more from the gallery to update headlines, now screaming criminal investigation, the women at the heart of it, Meri and Janelle, sat, not as victims, but as survivors who had turned silence into testimony, betrayal into evidence, and manipulation into the very rope with which their betrayers now hung themselves. And though the judge adjourned for the day, instructing all parties to return for closing statements, no one in that chamber doubted that. The verdict had already been written not in ink, but in the indelible etching of truth. A verdict louder than any gavel, that Kody's silence was guilt, that Robyn's tears were complicity, and that Meri's voice, long muted, had at last become the loudest sound in the room. The final day of the hearing arrived, not with curiosity, but with inevitability. The courthouse steps already thronged by cameras, microphones, protesters clutching candles, and onlookers who had come not merely to witness a verdict, but to participate in the funeral of a myth for what had begun as whispers of marital discord on a reality. Show had swelled into the roar of a trial that now touched upon fraud, betrayal, and the collapse of a dynasty paraded before millions. And as Meri Brown walked through the courthouse doors, she carried nothing but her own presence. No folders or exhibits, for she had already presented all she needed: her voice, her documents, her years of silence transfigured into testimony, and beside her, JanelleSteady.com, the quiet woman who had finally risen to reveal the machinery of exclusion and financial deceit. Their footsteps in sync, as though years of distance had collapsed into solidarity. While Kody entered through the side door flanked by lawyers, but without the swagger that once defined his public persona, his once prized golden mane tied back tightly, his shoulders hunched as though weighed down by every secret that had been dragged into the light. And Robyn, face puffy from days of tears, walked behind him with the look not of an innocent wife wronged, but of a co-architect finally forced to live in the ruins of her own design, her eyes darting to the gallery, but finding no sympathy there. For even those who once pitied her had seen too clearly the mask slip. And when the bailiff called for order, the room quieted into that uncanny stillness that carries more weight than thunder. Every breath held, every pen poised, every camera lens extended like a witness to history. And the judge, appearing grayer and sterner than at any previous session, adjusted his spectacles, leaned forward, and announced in measured tones that the time for testimony had concluded, that the court had examined documents, listened to recordings, considered emotional statements, and even witnessed confessions disguised as outbursts. And now only closing arguments remained before judgment would be rendered. And the prosecutor rose first, his voice steady but impassioned, reminding the jury and the gallery that this case was not about polygamy, not about televised drama, but about trust and betrayal, about contracts broken, about women silenced by design, about funds diverted under the cover of family rhetoric. And he replayed for emphasis a single line from the recording Robyn's chilling words she always gives up. She doesn't want to fight to remind them that the exclusion was not accident but strategy. That silence had been weaponized against women who had given everything to a man who promised forever and delivered betrayal. And then Meri's attorney rose, his tone lower, slower, almost reverent. And he said, "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, what you have seen here is not only financial misconduct, but a story of power, how love was twisted into leverage, how trust was turned into a currency to be traded, and how loyalty was rewarded with erasure. And my client, Meri Brown, has stood here not to punish, but to reclaim her dignity, to show the world what it means when silence is broken at last." And Meri herself rose, unprompted, and added softly, "I gave decades of my life to this family. I was told to wait, to be patient, to believe, and all that time the truth was being signed away behind closed doors. But today, finally, I have been heard, her voice carrying not as bitterness, but as benediction." And the gallery erupted into sniffles, scribbles, flashes. The humanity of her words resonating more deeply than any spreadsheet could. And then it was Kody's turn, his lawyer urging him to speak, and he stood, clearing his throat, voice hoarse. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I was trying to hold everything together, but the words rang hollow, for intent does not erase impact." And when pressed by the judge whether he denied the audio, whether he denied the transfers, he lowered his head and whispered, "No." And in that whispered admission, the myth of Kody Brown shattered completely. The patriarch undone by his own tongue, and Robyn, when invited to speak, rose shakily and said through sobs that she did it for love, that she wanted to protect the children, but her words dissolved into wails when the judge asked, "And was stealing from your sister's love? Was lying to them protection?" To which she had no answer, sinking back into her chair as though the weight of truth itself had pinned her there. And at last the judge, solemn, deliberate, delivered his verdict, speaking with the cadence of history, declaring that Kody and Robyn Brown had deliberately concealed assets, had violated agreements of equality, had used emotional manipulation to isolate and exclude. And while the case had begun as civil arbitration, it had blossomed into evidence of fraud sufficient to warrant criminal referral. And therefore he was freezing all accounts, ordering forensic audits, and passing the record to the state attorney for investigation of financial crimes. And more than that, he ruled that the estate funds, the royalties, intellectual properties tied to their family brand would no longer be under Kody's or Robyn's control, but redirected into a trust overseen by independent administrators, ensuring that those who had been erased would at last be restored in measure. And the courtroom gasped, reporters bolted, jurors shifted in awe. Meri closed her eyes and allowed one tear to roll unchecked. Janelle reached for her hand, and even Christine, though absent, seemed present in spirit. Her past courage vindicated by today's outcome, while Kody sat slumped. His empire of silence finally collapsed. And Robyn clutched her head in her hands as though trying to shut out the reality that her throne had crumbled to dust. And the judge concluded not with legalese, but with a statement that would echo far beyond the courthouse, saying, "Let this case remind us all. Marriage is not license for exploitation. Family is not an excuse for fraud, and silence is not consent. When trust is broken under the guise of love, the law must step in for justice, like truth cannot remain buried forever." And with that, the gavel fell. The room erupted into chaos, and outside the courthouse the crowd cheered, not in joy, but in solidarity, chanting Meri's name, Janelle's name, lifting candles high, their voices merging with hashtags already flooding the internet. Hashtag Justice for Meri, hashtag Robyn exposed, hashtag Kody falls, hashtag Sister Wives Truth dash. And as Meri emerged onto the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust, she did not shout or gloat. She simply raised her head high, whispered, "I'm free." and walked into the light. No longer the quiet wife edited into the margins of a television narrative, but a woman who had turned betrayal into truth, silence into power, and pain into freedom. And though the legal battles would stretch on, though Kody and Robyn would face investigations and trials yet to come, the true verdict had already been. Written in the hearts of those who watched, that Meri's voice, once drowned, had risen, that Janelle's silence had transformed into testimony, that Christine's departure had foreshadowed the fall, and that together, in defiance of years of manipulation, the sisterhood had at last reclaimed itself, and as the courthouse emptied, the sun broke through the clouds. And for the first time in decades, Meri felt not the weight of waiting, but the wings of release. And in that moment she knew, the world knew, that truth, though heavy, is lighter than silence. Silence.